All right, let's get rocking and rolling with one thing every government contractor must do every week. I hear from small businesses all the time that struggle to see the success that they want, right? In fact, I even personally go through this myself, just running the GovCon Chamber of Commerce. There's a lot of activity, a lot of things that go on. And so I sometimes struggle to be hitting the goals that I set for myself, et cetera. But tell me if any of this sounds familiar for you, right? This is me, but tell me if it sounds familiar to you and maybe why you're here today. I know that I need to focus, right? To focus down on what's important, but I have to ask myself, how do I figure out what's next? What's really the next thing I should be working on? I often feel overwhelmed, right? So much is on my plate. I sometimes don't know where to start, right? It is very helpful for me to have such a strong team, Cecilia, Gus, and others, where I can turn sometimes and go, what the heck are we working on? What are all these different projects we have? What's next? What's the most important thing? On this thing, where do we start? When we're feeling a little overwhelmed, we call it regrouping, stopping, looking at everything, and then figuring out where to start next. Another scenario is that I often feel like I worked really hard last week, right? I even missed some family events, but I couldn't really tell you if I got done what I wanted to get done. Of course, I know I did a lot of good stuff, right? But I felt like it was busy work more than specific accomplishments towards a goal I have. Not that busy work isn't necessary, right? Of course it is. And I'll talk about that in today's training, but it doesn't really move me towards my large goals. I have these particular large goals for the GovCon Chamber, and I need to be going back to them to make sure I'm working on them while I'm working on all this. I call it busy work, but it's really, it's important stuff that has to get done, but it's not driving towards where I'm at. And so sometimes I look back at my past week and say, wow, I worked really hard, but did I move the needle forward in the direction I want to go? And today's training is about that. It's about answering the question, what's next? Answering, where do I start? And today I'm going to be talking about the one thing, and I'm going to be focusing on weekly priorities, right? A weekly priority or one thing that I want to get done. But these should ideally be tied, these weekly one things that I'm going to talk about today, these should be tied to a much larger one thing in your company, such as winning $10 million in new sales. Maybe that's your goal for 2023 or 2024 is that you want to win $10 million in new sales. And so that's your one big thing. And then as you look at your weekly thing, it should be tied to that larger thing. So, one example of something, and I'll talk a lot more about this in the training as we go forward here, but one example of driving towards that one thing. Let me just check because I felt like I wasn't on there for a second. Sorry, a little tech hiccup. One of the examples of driving towards a $10 million goal, for example, is I might say, I know I want to have 8 strategic relationships with 8 different large primes. And so I want to go put that in place. So that's a bigger, longer term goal. And what we want to focus on today is that weekly one thing that's moving us forward, giving us that sense of movement and accomplishment. And that's what we're going to talk about. That's what I'm going to teach you in this training and helping you know what to get done. If you don't know who I am, my name is Neil McDonnell. I'm the president of the GovCon Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome you to my federal sales training where I teach tips for success in the federal market. I spent 20 years as a small business owner and in the federal market. And since 2018, I've been teaching people like you that government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process. Before we get started, do me a favor. Part of the process is letting others know who you are. So in the chat, put your company name and your core competency. Let people know who you are. Don't ever feel like you've done it enough times. We get buyers who come in here. We get large primes. We get other small businesses who are interested in finding companies like yours. So put your company name in there, put your core competency, and let people know who you are. One other thing, last thing I want to just say is thank you to our sustaining members. We are not funded by the federal government. We're not funded by larges. We're self-funded. We're funded by sustaining members like you and me. We're the ones who make this training possible and all the content that we put out possible. So just thank you on behalf of the small businesses out there who maybe aren't sustaining members, but are benefiting from it. I really appreciate that we can make that happen for them. Okay, so let's go ahead and knock out today's training. We're going to dive pretty deeply into this as we go forward. If you got questions, definitely follow back up with me. I'm trying to figure out whether we even do a course like this and put it into the sustaining members group. So if this is something you want more expansion on, let me know and we figure out how we can accommodate that. But the first thing I want to start with is just helping you understand this whole concept, this idea of the one thing, because I want you coming out of today thinking about what's the one thing I can be doing this week, or in this case, let's plan next week. What's the one thing we can do next week that if we do this one thing, it'll make everything else easier or even sometimes unnecessary. And I'll expand on that in a minute. There is a book out there called The One Thing, right? And so some people get the one thing idea from them, but this concept has been around for forever, right? And it's been around for a long, long time in my career. I first began to get exposed to it when I was in the Army back in the 90s, right? And but really my biggest mentor, personal mentor I've never met, is Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey wrote a book called The 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. If you haven't read it, read it, and read it every single year. You will not waste your time doing that. But inside of there, Stephen Covey talked about this whole idea of one thing with 2 different habits that he talks about. One is begin with the end in mind, right? This idea of where are you trying to go? Like I said a minute ago, maybe my end in mind, the goal is $10 million in new sales, right? And then, so that was habit 2, begin with the end in mind. Habit 3 was put first things first. And that's what we're talking about here. What's the one thing? What's the first thing first that you can work on? So an example is if I'm trying to get into the Air Force, and I've got customers who are trying to get into the Air Force. If I'm trying to get into the Air Force, well, what's the one thing I can do that'll make everything else I do easier? I don't know what that is, but we'll talk about that as we go forward, right? Again, the idea is when you think about this is, if I do this one thing that I'm setting for myself next week, this one thing, if I do it, it'll make the rest of my week go easier. It'll make the rest of my month and perhaps even year towards my yearly goals so much easier. For example, on a personal level, right? If I want to be healthier, what's the one thing that I could do that if I did it, it would make everything else easier or even unnecessary? And one example, one thing I could do for sure is I could drink 100 ounces of water, right? If I drank 100 ounces of water every single day, as I'm striving to get healthier, it will make everything else easier, right? I'm not here to be a scientist and tell you exactly how, but guaranteed, if I drink enough water every single day, that's a huge step towards me being healthier. And so I've identified the one thing that if I did it, it would make everything else easier. And that's really important. So then I start drinking water. It's why I have, that bottle I showed you. I have 4 of these sitting right there on my desk. So every day I'm drinking, actually it's a lot more than 100 ounces, but I'm drinking 4 32 ounces every day. It's the same thing for your business, right? What's your one thing for your business? What's one thing you could do next week for your business that if you did it, it would make everything else easier? And I'm going to go through and give you examples and help you answer that question if you don't have it right out of the gate. I did want to show you a matrix that Stephen Covey showed in the same book, right? 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. Let me just find it really quick. So in this, in this time management matrix, Stephen Covey talked about 4 quadrants where we spend our time. Quadrant 1 is on important and urgent things. So it's both important and urgent. Quadrant 2, it's not urgent, but it is important. And we'll come back to that because that's the magic quadrant. Quadrant 3, it's not important and it's urgent, right? And so usually that's often like the boss. And then quadrant 4, it's not important and it's not urgent. It's like binge watching the wrong show over and over again. It's so horrible, right? And inside of business, there's all sorts of stuff like, picking up the phone when it rings and you don't even know who it is. That's a complete quadrant 4. It's not urgent to you and it's not important to you. And you'll figure that out. But in this time matrix, and this is a handout, so if you want it, let me know. But I want you to focus on quadrant 2 because the one thing should be coming out of quadrant 2. What is not urgent in your business life, but it's important? If you did this one thing, it would make everything else easier. So when you think about the one thing for next week, it is always in quadrant 2. It's always like planning or strategizing. What are we going to do next, et cetera. And so that's really important to be tracking on. So remember, when you're planning your next week and you're thinking about the one thing, the one important thing that you're going to get done, I just want you to ask yourself, and I want you to ask yourself this question throughout today's training as you're thinking about the different as things I talk about give you different ideas. Ask yourself this question. It's an expansion of why, right? But this idea of what's the one thing that if I did it, it would make everything else in my life easier. And in this particular case, I'm basically talking on the federal market sales side of the business, right? If I did this thing, it would make sales so much easier. Everything else related to sales. And I'm going to expand on that. Do me a favor, put into the chat the one thing so I can drink water. Put the one thing into the chat if you understand this idea of what the one thing is. Okay, so before I go into a deep dive of examples, I wanted to actually tell you how to execute on your one thing. That way I have some tips here, but then as I move forward, I give you ideas. I've already talked about how do you execute. And what I really mean is if we determine the one thing today or this week for next week, right? How do you execute on that? How do you make sure you do that one thing? And I want to just give you some tips. The first thing is time block your one thing time, if you will, right? So you want to schedule time on your calendar and be committed to that time. What I recommend is that your one thing really on a weekly basis, your one thing should be a 2 to 4 hour task, right? It needs to fit into your busy week. You've got all sorts of stuff to do. You can't abandon quadrant 1 and you can't abandon quadrant 3 really in the office environment. So you're going to have those quadrant of activities. So you can't use up all of your 40 hours normal work week, but you can budget 2 to 4 hours to work on one thing. And when I start giving you examples in a minute, it'll make sense why I say 2 to 4 hours. It's small enough that you can commit to that time, and it's large enough that you can get something significant done. And so time block that 2 to 4 hours. If it makes better sense for you, once you determine what your one thing is, to block out 1 hour a day, right? So it combines to equal that 2 to 4 hour task. If that makes sense, do that. But whatever you do, the whole point of time blocking, you're blocking the time for you. You're blocking the time for quadrant 2, that is not urgent, but is important. You're blocking that time for the one thing that if you get it done, it'll make everything else in your life easier, right? And so block that time, schedule it on your calendar. You have to put that on your calendar. If you don't, you'll be at the mercy to all the other priorities and urgent activity. When you think about your executing on this, right, and you're determining your one thing, what I want you to do is to try to get it done the first thing in the week. So if you've got a whole week before you, right, I want you to determine in the week prior, so we're trying to do this week, what's next week's priority? And then when you go into the week in the Monday, just abandon everything else. If it is the one thing that is most important to your week, and that if you do it, it'll make the rest of your week easier and the rest of your business life easier, right? Then why wouldn't you do it as soon as possible? Why hold off on that? And so if you can, right, if you're a billable person, you're out with the customer, it's harder. But if you're in control of your calendar, push the least important meetings to the end of the week and put your one thing in the beginning. First thing Monday morning when you come in, right? A lot of people sometimes don't even like to take phone calls first thing Monday morning. Well, then put your one thing there. Figure out how you're going to make this happen. So that's a good way to do it. If it has to slide, it can slide. But the idea is get it done as early as possible in the week so that the week does not push it out, right? If you commit to getting it done as early as possible, of course, calendaring it. But if you get it done early on, you'll make sure that you're doing it every time. Okay, so let me talk about how you can find your one thing. And again, this is related to business development and capture, proposal writing. It's related to sales within the federal market. And so we've got about 10, 12 minutes, and I want to go through some examples that I would use if I'm working with your company trying to determine a one thing. And if I can, I'm going to try to keep looking at chat in a minute here from this point forward. So if it already went into chat, I'll miss it a little bit for now. I'll see it later. But as I go forward, if you've got a question about the one thing from what I'm saying, and you go, well, what would my one thing be? Try to throw a question into the chat, and I'll be happy to try to address it today. So I recommend you pull out a piece of paper and notes, because as I go along, you're going to have ideas that pop into your head. They'll be there for a little bit, but if you don't write it down, you'll forget about it. I'm just going to be like an instigator of your brilliant ideas about what your one thing is. But I'd hate to see you have a brilliant idea, go, oh, if I did that, it'd be great. And then you forget it later. So make sure you have a way to record this. So before I go too far, I want to start with the 7-step process, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the 7-step process that I teach for federal success and to make money, right, in the federal government, it's the 7-step process is right here. And I like going from the end, reverse engineering, right? Beginning with the end in mind is sales. Right here at the bottom of the circle, if I want to make sales, I have to write winning proposals. And if I'm going to write winning proposals, then I must have a pipeline full of slam dunk opportunities that are guaranteed my company could win because we have so much past performance or we have so much skill around it. In order to find those slam dunk opportunities, I need to have strategic relationships with agency buyers and teammates out there so that I can even hear about the opportunities, so that I can explore or even introduce the idea of a new opportunity with agencies or with teammates. In order to build those strategic relationships, I must call people. I must pick up the phone and do outreach on a regular basis. I should be doing outreach to federal buyers and to agents or to teammates. In order to outreach, right, you can see where this is going as you reverse engineer it. I need to have a list of who am I going to call. At any given point, I keep a running list of 100 to 200 people for customers that I work with, saying, this is who you're going to be calling. We guide them on how to make the calls and how to go forward. And we begin that part by saying, look, do the targeting. Make sure you have 100 to 200 names, numbers, and emails so it's easy to do outreach when you've got time on your calendar. And then the first part of this 7-step process, the first step is research. You have to understand your teaming partner, a little bit about them, or you have to understand your federal agency buyers. You have to research their agency. I like to say, get to know them better than they know themselves. If you do, then you'll learn a lot about their challenges, their goals. You'll also learn about opportunities. And as it assists with targeting, you'll see all sorts of people who are in charge. I was helping somebody with IRS yesterday. We've got a customer that's targeting IRS. And one of the ways we do our research and targeting is we build an org chart using a mind map. I use MindMeister, so Gus or somebody can drop a link in there for that if you want it. But when we built it out, I was able to build out like almost 100 different offices within IRS. IRS is just this one agency within Treasury. But inside of there, because I was doing research and because I was finding such good information, I was able to find all these offices and then begin to put people's names on it. Because I have that, I can then move forward and find emails and phone numbers. So anyways, let me bring this back then. Keep in mind the 7-step process as I go forward. One of the first things I would do if I'm planning next week, right, is I would look at the 7-step process and say to myself, where on that process is it most important I spend my time, that if I do spend my time on it, it'll make everything else easier. So an example is, let's say that we're struggling with sales and opportunities and all that. I might look in and go, you know what? I need strategic relationships. I need to look in here, and I think I mentioned this before, but I want to grow $10 million in the Air Force, let's say. Well, I need to go find and build 8 strategic relationships, and you can watch other training why I say 8's an important number, but 8 strategic relationships with large prime contractors, because I have past performance that they'll value, so it makes sense for me to talk to large prime contractors. So my one thing that I want to work on next week on this entire 7-step process is relationships. I believe that if I can move the ball on relationships, it'll make everything else in the 7-step process easier. It'll make everything else related to my sales goals, et cetera, easier. And so then, because I did that, I will look at that relationship now, that step, and go, well, what's the 2 to 4 hour task? The one thing I can do this week. I can't build relationships in a single week, right? I can start them. So what's the one thing I'm going to do? Well, I want to go into the Air Force. I sell artificial intelligence and machine learning, let's say, or cybersecurity, because I got a customer going into Air Force cybersecurity. I sell cybersecurity. Let me go in to the Air Force and the tools that the government provides us and go research which large primes are winning the work that is most aligned to the cybersecurity work that I do. When I do that, I'll come up with CACI or CACI or Booz Allen or Leidos or whoever they are. I'll come up with these companies and I'll be able to see which ones truly are sitting at the top. Just because they're a billion-dollar firm doesn't mean they're a billion-dollar firm succeeding in the Air Force, right? And so I want to find that out, and I will determine that that's my one thing that this coming week, I'm going to determine who my 8 strategic teaming partners are within the Air Force, the large prime contractors. And I'll tackle that next week. That task will take me 2 to 4 hours because I got to download the data of wins over the past few years, look at contracts that might be expiring, go look at some of the Air Force contract vehicles, maybe see who's on there and see who's winning, that kind of information. It's a research activity, right? ironically, the strategic relationship part that I'm trying to do ties in a little bit to the research and targeting, but I'll be doing that to start building the relationship. So I came up with that task. The one thing I could do next week that'll make everything else easier is to find the 8 strategic partners I want to reach out to. Following weeks, it might be something like reach out and actually have an introduction meeting or schedule an introduction meeting. A second example that you can go through when you're trying to determine you're just looking down, see if I got any questions there. The second thing that you can go through when you look at the 7-step process, and I like the 7-step process that we teach because it is so simple. I spent 20 years with people teaching me Shipley and all this other complex stuff that's not built for small businesses. Way too complex, way too much friction between my buyer and my team when you introduce process steps that are 100 steps or something, right? So the 7-step process is really designed to help me just quickly go, am I doing the right 7 things to move my company towards the goals we've set for ourselves? So the first thing I did was look at the 7-step process and said, what's the most important thing? Well, the next thing I would recommend you do when you're thinking about what's the one thing I can do next week, that if I do it, it'll make everything else easier. Well, in this situation, I like to look at every one of the 7 steps. And I make it sound like it's big when I say every one, but each of the 7 steps, and just very quickly go, what's one thing I can do in research that if I do it, it'll make everything else easier? An example could be, I want to go find an industry day, an APBI. I think, I can't even remember what it stands for, but somebody will put it into the chat. But I want to find industry day briefings over the last 6 months from the Air Force, especially if I can find it related to cyber, maybe PEO digital, whatever, right? And so I want to find that. And the reason is because I believe if I find that, it'll help me identify which agency program offices are dealing with cyber. And in those industry briefs, I often find people's names that I can then go research. So that's one thing that if I did it, it would make everything else easier because I'm doing the research, I'm understanding the agency better, and I'm finding names, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So each one of the 7 steps as you move forward. Another example might be looking at the targeting. One thing I'm going to do, and I've done this already with one of my customers, is if I'm going into the Air Force and I'm pursuing cyber, then I want to do targeting. So I'm going to build a list of 100 names. I won't even worry about the phone numbers for a second. 100 names of people within the Air Force related to cyber. In this case, I'm only talking about government people, right? If I build it 1 to 200, I'll include teaming partners, but 100 government people related. And that sounds like a lot, right? And it is a lot, but it's not a lot when it's in an agency that has tens of thousands of employees, right? I could find 100 different offices that do cyber within the Air Force. I built out an org chart. I did this a while ago, right? I built out the DoD cyber footprint, if you will, or org chart. And this is all the cyber offices within DoD. And inside of the Air Force, you could go into one major command like 16th Air Force and begin to find offices after offices. And from those, you begin to find people's names. And so when I look at the second step of the 7-step process to success, it's targeting, and targeting is about finding people. So I say to myself, one thing I could do is this. If you're a business, if you're a busy small business owner, sometimes it's hard to do a lot, right? If I can get one thing done, that's perfect. That's great. It's moving it forward because I got all this other stuff. But if you're a business developer, if you're a capture manager, you got 40 hours to do all of this. And these one things I'm talking about, you can really look at these. If you look at opportunities, what's the one thing I could do in opportunities that if I did it, it would make everything else easier? An example might be for an opportunity. If I found a teammate who was actually in the Air Force doing cyber on an opportunity that I have in my pipeline, it would make everything easier because now I'm not alone. They're inside the wire. Maybe they can help me with information, whatever it is, right? One thing I might do with an opportunity is I might go find previous past performances, so work statements, so I can look at the work and how it was laid out in the task areas before. If I've got a current RFP, a PWS or draft PWS, I might compare them, see what's going on. But you can look in, right? In each one of these areas, including sales, you can look in and go, what's the one thing that if I did it, I would make everything else easier? And let me just hit sales so I don't sit there and just throw that out. If I was looking at sales and I was in your company and we're trying to evaluate sales, One thing I could do next week that would make everything else easier is if I looked at sales and truly, truly understood why I won or why I lost. So if I recently had some wins or losses, to look at that and truly not fluff, but look at that and go, why did we win it? Why did we lose it? Honestly, why did we lose it? Not blaming a person, but looking at our process and go, what about our process helped us win it? What about our process drove to us losing it, kind of thing. So you can look at sales and have a one thing. And if you figure that out, then it makes capture easier because you say, do more of the things we did right and do less of the things we didn't do quite so well. Okay, so I've already used the Air Force example. I was trying to look at that. I don't see questions in there, which is perfect. So if you've got questions about like how to do, and I don't know if chat just stopped, but if you got questions as it relates to the one thing, let me know. The idea of the one thing is really important because if you want to see measurable progress towards your goal, you need to choose one thing that you're going to focus on each week to get it done. And if you get it done, it's going to make everything else easier. If all you do is go into next week and start it overwhelmed, right? Oh my God, there's so much going on this week. I got all this stuff. There are pressures from last week. We got all these new things coming up. If you go into it and you haven't planned your one thing, then your week will run your life, your professional life, your sales life, right? Your week will run it instead of you determining what's the one thing I could do that's going to make everything else better. Hey, if you found value in today's training, do me a favor, become a sustaining member and help us continue putting this training out to everybody else. Help others benefit from your support. If your company is struggling to start and build relationships in the federal market with federal buyers, consider our 90-day BD Accelerator workshop. You can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn to learn more about it, but don't reach out until you watch like 5 or 10 of my videos. Make sure you kind of understand who I am and what we teach, because that's what we're going to do in our workshop. Remember, government contracting, it is not a secret. It's just a process. I'll see you in the next training. If you're doing Navy, we've got Matt Burkett tomorrow doing our Navy. He's one of our first guest speakers, so I'm pretty excited about that. Come back and join us then.